Hello and welcome to our panel discussion, Reshaping Britain, Economic Lessons from COVID, hosted by the House magazine at this year's virtual Labour conference, Labour Connected. My name is Kate Proctor. I'm the political editor of the House magazine and PoliticsHome. We've got a really fantastic panel to discuss all of our burning questions on the economy. We've got Rachel Reeves, Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, shadowing Michael Gove. Government's COVID response and Brexit are some of her key leading areas at the moment. We've got Bridget Phillipson, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury and a key part of Keir Starmer's economic team. We've also got Laura Hutchinson, Head of UK Business and Political Intelligence for Dods, and Kate Bell, Head of Rights, International, Social and Economics at the TUC. But just first of all, just to set out the kind of state of play and where we are, GDP had a record fall of 20% in April. There's expected job losses coming this autumn and also debts rising dramatically. So the country is in a very, very difficult situation at the moment. I just wanted to hear thoughts, first of all, from the panel, just a couple of minutes of opening remarks, basically on how you feel the economic forecast might be this autumn, what you're going to be looking towards, and any points that you have at this moment in time on COVID and the economic lessons that we've had so far. So could we start, please, with Rachel?
Thank you very much, Kate, and it's great to join you all in this virtual session at our party conference today, just after our Shadow Chancellor, Annalisa Dods, has given her speech to conference. Look, we all face the threat of the coronavirus, but we don't all face it equally, not in terms of our health and not in terms of how we are prepared economically either. Keir has asked me in this role to look at some of the long-term challenges that Labour face and how we can rebuild both after 4 election defeats, but also after this pandemic. And I hope that what we've gone through in the last few months, and frankly still have to go through, will be the jolt that we need to create something better, the fairer and more equal society that all of us want to see because of the lessons that we've learnt during this crisis. So what do I mean when I say that the effects of the virus are not felt equally? Well, if you live in one of the 26 tower blocks in my constituency in Leeds West, your experience of coronavirus is very different if you live in a house with a garden and access to outside space. If you have a full-time permanent job with an employer who lets you take time off if you are sick or if your child needs caring for, then you're in a very different situation compared to if you're on a 0-hour contract or other insecure work. If you are one of the 11.5 million people who had less than £100 worth of savings going into this crisis, you're going to experience it all very differently compared to if you are financially secure. What have we learned from this crisis, particularly on the economic front? Well, we've learned, as Keir has already said, that the key workers are not those who are on the highest incomes, but those who work in our NHS, social care, supermarket workers, distribution drivers, teachers, often those in our society who are underappreciated, undervalued and underpaid, but without whom the rest of society and our economy would not be able to function. And I don't want to go back to a situation where we were in before, where despite the clapping that we did on a Thursday evening, we continue to undervalue those workers. But also we've seen the impact of the hollowing out of the state over the last 10 years with austerity. And the government now respond to that by outsourcing public services. And it's, I think, a knee-jerk reaction for them. But this pandemic has taught us just how addicted this government is to outsourcing. And it is unacceptable that so many public contracts have been awarded without tender to Conservative Party friends and donors. This government has redirected money away from local authorities and the NHS into the pockets of a few private providers. And as we're seeing with the Serco test and track model, it is just not working and is exacerbating both the health and the economic challenges that we face right now. I recognise that those are only supposed to be short remarks, and I could talk for so much longer, as you know, Kate, but I'll leave it there and leave others to contribute and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Bridget, can we go to you next?
Thanks very much for having me. I don't know if my video was going a bit all over the place there, whether it was just my end. Sorry, right, so I don't know what's going on, so sorry about that, the kind of pitfalls of doing these things remotely, but thanks very much. I mean, just really to add to what Rachel said, I mean, picking up the point that she made around, you know, as a country going into the crisis, the level of financial resilience was far below what it needed to have been. And, you know, the number of adults without savings, as she said, and those who've, you know, had to move on to less secure jobs and self-employment, I think has really been put into sharp focus. And I was genuinely taken aback to discover this summer from the Public Accounts Committee that the UK had no contingency plans for the economic aspects of a pandemic. You know, this has been, you know, at the top of the government's risk register for a decade, but we didn't have those plans in place for what the economic response would look like in the event of a pandemic. And I think in terms of our ability to respond, we've learned that the government has the technical ability to get money to people, and that has been absolutely needed. But we've also learned that they've not been very keen on using that vast amount of data that government harvests to make sure that it's always going to the right places and is targeted appropriately. And Annalisa Dods, our Shadow Chancellor, set that out today around mistakes that are being made and how Labour's approach would be different, and how we want to work with the government to design schemes that will make sure we get the money put into the best place where it's needed and used most effectively. And I think just one final point to touch on, you know, I think it's really exposed issues around the role of women within our society, you know, the disproportionate impact that the pandemic is having in terms of women's jobs, their role in the labour market, and that they're often left to pick up the slack when it comes to childcare. You know, they're more likely to have been furloughed, more likely to have lost their jobs, and it risks exacerbating many of those underlying inequalities that we already see within our society. So I think, as Annalisa set out today, it also makes us, I think very carefully about the kind of recovery that we'll need to see, how we create green jobs of the future, and how we plan for a more sustainable and fairer future for all as we emerge, hopefully, from this pandemic before too long.
Thanks a lot, Bridget. Thanks. Kate L, are you able to go next?
Thanks very much for having me. I wanted to echo quite a lot of what Rachel and Bridget were saying about what we've learned during this pandemic. The fact that our key workers are undervalued. Our research shows that 4 in 10 key workers earn less than £10 an hour, a kind of scandalous undervaluing of the people who've kept us going. I think we've had exposed rather than created the extent of inequality which still marks kind of the world of work and our country, whether that's along the lines of race, gender, class or disability. We've seen disproportionate death rates, we've seen the unequal impacts, as Bridget said, on who's bearing the impact of redundancies. We've seen the decimation of our public realm after 10 years of austerity, and we've also seen just how important it is for workers to have a voice in the workplace, and how often they don't feel able to speak out, whether that's about safety at work or whether that's about the lack of adequate sick pay. But I think we have seen also that government can move fast when it needs to, whether that's the job retention scheme or actually the kind of increase in benefits which we've seen during the pandemic, to a really significant increase actually of £20, insufficient in terms of how much people are receiving. And the fact that government actually, having kind of dithered around these issues for a long time, could actually change course pretty quickly. And I think it's really important we focus on that ability to change course and what government might actually do next. So just to say a tiny bit about that, and hopefully, you know, in a slightly more hopeful note, I think we've set out a plan for a new job protection and upskilling scheme to replace the furlough scheme, similar to what Annalisa was talking about today, and really keen to see that moving quickly. We know we need a massive jobs creation programme, and one that should be addressing some of the challenges we already knew we faced. So We have a plan for 1.24 million jobs in the green economy, for 600,000 jobs in our public services, fixing our social care system. We know we need a decent social safety net. If more people are going to face redundancy, they will realise just how inadequate our system of social security has been, the problems with universal credit, the 5-week wait to receive your first payment, which adds to that lack of resilience that Bridget was talking about, but really the inadequacy of benefit levels. And I think it's really interesting that the government's new payment to people who are self-isolating is worth £500 over 2 weeks. Current benefit levels, even after that boost, are worth just £200. So I think there's a case to be made to say, well, if you need £500 to stay at home, that's probably what you need to live in normal times when you've lost your jobs. I also think we should be kind of applying what we've learned during the pandemic to our rebuilding. So 3 principles we probably set out for that process. One, that of course we should be guiding our industrial strategy, guiding our job creation by the need to meet net zero. And it was great to hear Annalisa talking so strongly about that today. Secondly, of course, we need to be rebuilding our public services and thinking about also how we can use that to rebalance our economy. And thirdly, and most importantly for us, we have to put decent jobs at the heart of our recovery. We know that's the best way to recover, both economically and to actually pay respect to some of the kind of pain and suffering we've seen during the pandemic and how that's fallen disproportionately on workers.
Thanks very much, Kate. Laura, are you able to, I mean, you probably see things from a bit of a different perspective, from a client's perspective, from Dods. What's your take on things?
Yeah, thank you, Kate. Really excited to be on this all-female panel as well, so thank you for inviting me. I'm Laura Hutchinson. I'm the Principal Political Consultant and Head of UK Business and Political Intelligence here at Dods. So it's quite a jargony title there, but essentially what we do is we advise and help clients who are sort of public sector leaders, charities, businesses, try and help them navigate the rather turbulent political landscape. So we've obviously had a very busy few years here, firstly with the chaos and paralysis of Brexit, and now with this horrendous global health pandemic, which has cost nearly 42,000 lives now and shut down huge swathes of the economy. As you mentioned at the beginning, like we heard from Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance this morning, and it's very clear that the pandemic is far from over. It's going to be a very difficult winter for many as well, as has been alluded to. So the Trussell Trust, who are a food bank network, they forecast a 61% increase in food parcels needed from between October and December this year. So that's 6 food parcels given out every minute, and the Trussell Trust are just one food bank provider in this country. There's forecasts of 500,000 people could become unemployed this autumn, and the universal credit system that many of those people would be relying on is already creaking and struggling to cope with demand. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Bridget and Rachel about the Labour response, and obviously from Kate from the union perspective as well. I would just say, you're right, I come from a more objective stance point on this, and the reality that I think we always have to be aware of is that Boris Johnson has won a significant majority, and it's very unlikely that there'll be a general election before 2024. This means in practice that he's emboldened pretty much to do what he likes for the next 4 years, and many of those decisions he takes could have really destabilizing and damaging effects on our economy. So I mentioned the pandemic, obviously, but the reality is the government are actually facing 2 economic crises on their agenda for this year. So the first is unavoidable. It was due to the pandemic and the lockdown that subsequently ensued. The second is going to be entirely self-inflicted, though, and this is to do with Brexit and the transition period, which is due to end in December. So Boris Johnson and his government have taken the position in lockdown, when the UK was going through, is going through a global health pandemic, that they are not going to extend the transition period despite a deal not being in place. So businesses who are already struggling could be facing a very, very severe hit in the next couple of months. So looking forward to getting stuck into all of that, and apologies in advance if it's not particularly cheery as well.
There's no way of making this cheerful, I don't think. Rachel, I wanted to ask you first, has talk of a V-shape, U-shape economic recovery been premature? Where are we at, and what do you think the big staging posts will be for the economy this autumn?
So far, the economy does seem in the last month, a bit longer, to have recovered some of the lost ground. But there are an additional 750,000 people claiming unemployment benefits from compared with before the crisis, and even more people who have become economically inactive. So they're not looking for work, in part probably because they worry there isn't work available, but also because people are having to take on caring responsibilities because of the crisis in childcare, and because although schools are now reopened for all children, many schools aren't having breakfast clubs or after school clubs. And so in many families, somebody, and usually the woman, and that goes to the point that Kate and Bridget were making earlier, I'm very worried about what happens to women's employment and women's wages through the course of this crisis, because the greater availability of childcare and wraparound care at schools did enable many more women to participate in the labour market. And then at the other end, you've got older people who also need carers, and for obvious reasons, a lot of families are going to be very reluctant to use care homes right now, which puts more pressure usually on women to do that caring. I don't think that we're going to see economic activity get back to the levels that we saw before the crisis anytime soon. I think some of the forecasts, for example, from the Bank of England probably are a bit too optimistic right now. And certainly, Kate, what you referenced at the beginning about the press conference this morning from Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty suggests that the restrictions the very tough restrictions that were in place across the whole country are likely to be returning in some shape or form, which is going to further reduce economic activity, which is exactly why Annalisa and Bridget as well have been calling for a more flexible furlough scheme, because the furlough scheme was a huge support for people both directly employed and self-employed during the crisis. And it would be such a mistake to pull the rug from beneath people's feet before firm foundations are set for rebuilding businesses. And so many people have not been able to go back to work, and so many businesses are not operating at full capacity, whether it's aerospace, hospitality, retail, across the economy. Many businesses, and that's why in Germany, you've got this scheme to enable businesses to bring people back part-time, with the state providing income support on the other side. So I do think that it is a mistake of the government to pull that support away before the economy is functioning, and I think it will make it harder for our economy to recover fully, because one of the key points of the furlough scheme was to keep businesses and workers in touch with each other to enable the economy to recover more swiftly when it's safe to do so. So I don't think we're going to have a V-shaped recovery. I think there's much more government could do to support the economy during these difficult times, which would enable a swifter recovery on the other side.
Thank you. Bridget, how, if we're talking about economic recovery, if that's even something we can contemplate at the moment, I mean, how many years do you think we're talking about to try and get back to some of those sort of GDP levels that we had pre-crisis? How long do you think this could possibly take?
Yeah, thanks very much. And apologies, I dipped out briefly for some technical reasons. So I'm back on a slightly different, less great format, but sorry about that. I mean, I would agree with what Rachel's just said there, which is it's very hard, I think, to predict with any great degree of certainty what the future will hold, given, I think, especially the very troubling press conference we had earlier that I think brought into sharp focus the fact that we're far from through this crisis, which is why, you know, we've been for months now calling for the government to bring forward that targeted flexible support to, you know, allow those sectors of our economy that will struggle to keep going, that will face additional pressures owing to the restrictions placed upon them, but that are central to our country's economic future, to come through this and come out the other side. Because, you know, I've had conversations with so many family businesses that have been going for such a long time, that have weathered storms, that have been through all kinds of difficulties in the past, but have still managed to come through. And there's just a creeping sense of frustration from them that the government appears unwilling to listen to the really, you know, the genuine concerns that they have around the difficulties they will face for a very long time to come, which is why, you know, it still isn't too late for the Chancellor to change course, to listen to those businesses, to listen to workers, and to chart a different course. You know, he can't allow his stubbornness in the face of what is, you know, the biggest threat our country has faced in a generation to hold Britain back from the recovery that we'll need to see. And, you know, growth will be central to that. But if we end up in a position where we have eroded our tax base because far more people are out of work and far more businesses have gone to the wall than was necessary if government intervened and provided that targeted support, it will make the task so much harder. So, as I say, it's very hard to make predictions, but we know that having faced, you know, the worst excess death rate in Europe and facing one of the worst recessions in the G7, you know, the task ahead of us is a difficult one, which is why, you know, the government must listen to the calls from trade unions, from businesses and from Labour. And, you know, we heard very clearly from Annalisa today that we'll work with government to design a scheme that can allow for that short hours working, that can provide targeted wage support to those sectors of our economy most in trouble. And we just hope that the government will take up that call and will work with us, because, you know, it is in the national interest, and we have sought to be constructive throughout this process.
So if the government does take on some of Labour's positions on targeted wage support, for example, extending furlough in a targeted way, I mean, are we still talking, in your opinion, you know, a decade of economic uncertainty? The recovery could take, you know, a generation. What's your feeling?
It is genuinely very hard to appreciate the scale of what we're facing. You know, this could be a pandemic that we deal with. It could be a pandemic that morphs and returns, or it could be the first of many pandemics that we face. We know that, you know that is likely to be an increased risk both to our country and to the world for a long time to come. But all we can do is confront what's in front of us right now, and the decisions that the government will take in these weeks and months ahead will shape the nature of the recovery that we'll see. And, you know, it isn't too late. And we hope that, you know, Rishi Sunak will take up the call that Annalisa made today to design that kind of scheme that will see targeted support to those hard hit sectors. Because, you know, we understand that furlough can't continue indefinitely, but we don't have all of the data that is available to government in designing that scheme. And we saw what can be done very effectively when government works with trade unions and works with businesses, as they did in the design of the furlough scheme. And we hope that the government will adopt that approach in looking to the future now as well.
Thank you. And Rachel, what are the specific sectors that do need targeted wage support? Could you pick out 3 different types of job that might need this extended help?
So I think that there are some obvious sectors, Kate. If you look at the creative industries, for example, there are real challenges there at the moment for obvious reasons in terms of people getting together. The hospitality sector, notwithstanding the support during the summer, social distancing obviously makes it very hard to operate at full capacity. But also some parts of our manufacturing sector, particularly aerospace, which of course has been very badly affected by the fall in demand for air travel and the uncertainty about that. But it's not just about sectors of the economy, it's also about parts of the country, because some parts of the country have been worse affected than others. And notwithstanding the likelihood of further restrictions in the days and perhaps hours and certainly the weeks ahead, we already know that this, and this is according to government scientists, that the virus is now endemic in some of our poorest communities. So there also needs to be targeted help in those communities that have borne the brunt of the coronavirus particularly thinking of towns in the north of England that the government spoke of a lot before the election, but I'm afraid I've done very little to support since then. And they're the ones who are often paying the highest price right now for the failure of the government.
It could be done by region, perhaps, regional wage support. So a form of furlough could continue perhaps for, I don't know, Blackburn or Wigan, something like that.
Well, the reason that Labour is calling for a flexible furlough scheme is so that it's available for the people who need it, rather than pulling the rug away from people. And the government have used a blanket approach of the jobs bonus scheme, and a lot of that money will frankly be wasted because they were jobs that were coming back anyway. The government should have had a more targeted support framework to support jobs that are at risk of being lost because demand has not picked up. And I think it was a real missed opportunity not to really see through the furlough scheme until it was no longer needed. And that is a mistake which I think will cost the government, but actually most importantly is already costing people who are now finding themselves out of work or really worried about where they're going to be in 5 weeks' time when the furlough scheme comes to an end in its entirety. Okay.
Bridget, I just wanted to move on to the discussion of tax, if that's okay. I think there's been a bit of a discussion that now is not the time for tax rises, and also you are quite far out from another election. But you know, with the way that things are going with the economy, you know, do you think tax rises are inevitable at some point over the course of this Parliament? And would Labour, you know, would you support looking at things like increasing fuel duty? Where would you try and make some money, basically, for the Treasury?
I mean, we've set out very clearly that we don't think now is the right time for tax rises, given that, you know, the recovery is far from guaranteed. We're facing a difficult winter ahead. We think that would be the wrong time, that it would pull demand out of the economy and isn't what is needed right now. You know, central to what comes next is making sure that we have growth within the economy, which is why Annalisa today set out our plan for what that kind of approach could look like under Labour. But in terms of those bigger questions around what our tax policy will be going into the next general election, we don't yet know what the shape of the economy will be at that point. And of course, we'll set out all of our plans much closer to the time. But I think it will be premature to get into a discussion around what we'll be saying at a much later stage as part of our manifesto process. What we're focused on right now is making sure that we keep as many people in work as is possible. We make sure that good, viable businesses are able to get through this really tough period. And as Rachel just said there, that we make sure where we're spending public money to that effect, that we're spending it wisely, that we're spending it well, and we're not wasting any of it. You know, that deadweight cost that the Chancellor conceded comes with the jobs retention bonus, we think could be better spent on making sure that people have, you know, the good businesses are supported to come through the crisis. His counter to much of the argument is that it's unfair to compare Britain to, say, Germany, because Germany's had a scheme in place for 10 years. Well, it does rather lead to the question as to why Britain hasn't been doing similar contingency planning around the pandemic. We've had a Conservative government now for a decade. I find it a rather peculiar line of argument that he advances to say that, well, Germany's had it for 10 years. I think perhaps they should be asking some questions of themselves as to why we were so poorly prepared, not just from a public health response point of view, but also why those big challenges around likely pandemics weren't factored in to that modelling that was being undertaken in the Treasury and elsewhere.
Do you think it's inevitable that there will need to be tax rises because the country just can't keep on taking on all this debt? It is something that will have to happen.
What is central to the months and years ahead is making sure that we see growth back in our economy, because if we see lots of people out of work, if we see good businesses going bust, we'll erode that tax base and it will make it that much harder, because if people are not paying taxes, if they're not in work, it will make that recovery far much more difficult. What we want to see a focus on right now is keeping people in work and getting businesses through it, and seeing a return to growth and a sustainable recovery, providing hope and opportunity right across our country, rooted in those new jobs of the future in the green economy as well.
I'm not sure how the country can make much more money if it doesn't resort to taxes?
As I say, we're not at the point right now where we're calling for tax rises. We don't think that's the right approach. We don't think we're at that point. We've got a long way to go in seeking to come through this crisis, and to pull away demand at such a central point, such a critical moment for our economy, we think would be a mistake.
Okay, thank you. Kate, I wondered if I could talk to you a bit about how the economic recovery, although it feels that this is still a very abstract concept because we're right slap bang in the middle of an economic response rather than recovery. What do you think are the essential things to stop it impacting on key workers and the lowest paid? You had that statistic there that 4 in 10 key workers earn under £10. So how do the poorest in society not pay the price of this next recession?
Thanks. Well, I'd echo everything Rachel and Bridget have said about the importance of the job retention scheme. It is actually lower paid earners who are predominantly losing their jobs, and that targeted and flexible support and support that includes training is really, really vital to protect them. But what we've got to do is not make sure that we are exclusively focused on job quantity, but also focused on job quality too, and rewarding those key workers. I think one of the shocking stats that's come out of this pandemic is the number of people on 0 hours contracts actually went over 1 million for the first time. And the biggest rises were exactly in those key worker professions, so amongst social care workers and amongst those in the retail sector. The TC has been campaigning for a long time for that ban on 0 hours contracts. It's still something we want to see. I think that would be one way to show we've actually said, you know, this type of insecure work, where you don't know when you're working one day from the next, you don't know whether you're going to get sick pay, you don't know how to organise your childcare, just isn't acceptable in today's economy. And I think we've also seen the costs of some of those insecure models in other ways. There's some interesting research from the Office for National Statistics showing that care homes with more agency staff were likely to see higher infection rates. They had a less stable workforce, and of course that's, you know, deeply damaging for the workers, but was having impacts on the quality of care they could provide to. So I think tackling that insecurity in the labour market, banning 0 hours contracts, really important step. Ensuring that the low paid are getting a pay rise, so going ahead with increases in the national minimum wage, and then ensuring that everyone has a voice at work. And I think once again, you know, we have seen during this crisis, particularly in the terms of health and safety, workers were saying early on, you know, we don't have the PPE we need, this isn't working, we're not getting the sick pay, and that's making it hard for us to self-isolate. Workers were telling people that right from the start from the pandemic, and it's taken an awful long time for bosses to listen and for the government to listen too. And I think that's why, you know, structures which give people more of a voice at work, more of a say in their terms and conditions, and, you know, we'd say that should be through trade unions, have also got to be a vital legacy of what comes out of, you know, what we've learned or what we've seen exposed ever more during this crisis.
So were you a bit alarmed to read that Rishi Sunak might be considering public sector wage rises that don't go above inflation?
I think, you know, I'm hoping that's some scaremongering, basically. I'm pretty shocked, I think most people would be, to see that a public sector pay freeze and a benefits freeze being considered over the weekend. That's what left our public servants underpaid, as well as our public services underinvested in over the last decade. It's what led many people to be relying on those food banks that Laura was talking about earlier. You know, we did hear at the beginning kind of a lot more recognition for, you know, the challenges that different people are facing, the appreciation for those care workers. A public sector pay freeze and a benefits freeze would be, you know, I think a kick in the teeth to everybody who's got us through this crisis.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Rachel, if I could just ask you some questions. You'll have seen the YouGov poll that shows Labour's behind the Conservatives in terms of being trusted on the economy. I think at one point it's a 20-point, Labour's 20 points behind. Do you think that Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, do you think they wreck the reputation of Labour in terms of economic, financial competence?
Well, first of all, I'd just say that we've come an awful long way since our devastating election defeat in December, our worst defeat since 1931. And the poll at the weekend, I mean, you know, we can point to the bits of it that are not such good news for us. But, you know, the key point from that poll is that Labour and Tories are neck and neck at 40 in the polls. And after that defeat, very recently, you know, that is good progress, and I think reflects really well on Keir and the leadership that he's provided to the party. Are we worried that we're still behind on the economy and in some other areas as well? Absolutely, and we are determined to close that gap. And we know that we've got a mountain to climb, but we have started on that journey, and I think we've got off to a really good start in that process. But as Kia has said, this isn't a 5-month project or a 1-year project. This is a project to get us to 2024, and the poll that will matter is obviously been said before, but it is true. It is the one on election day. But we do need to do more to ensure that people trust us with their money and with the running of the economy. But I think anyone who listened to Annalisa's speech today, or what Bridget's saying today, can be in no doubt that Labour will be good custodians of public finances with the right priorities and the right values. And we need to get that message out loud and clear to close that gap, as well as building on the progress that Kia's already made and we've all made in the last few months.
And Bridget, when it comes to massive spending commitments, so Operation Moonshot, which is Boris Johnson's ambition for testing, is extremely expensive. Is that something that Labour would constructively support?
I mean, Rachel might want to add on some of this. She leads on many of these issues for us. I mean, frankly, it would just be nice if we could have a halfway functioning test, trace and isolate system, never mind some grand plan with a fancy name attached to it. Because for those constituents that I speak to who can't now go to work, or whose children can't go to school because they can't get a test, and we're a part of the country in the northeast where we're facing at the moment additional restrictions because of the rising infection rate, I think they just want a government with a basic level of competence that can deliver on these important areas that are not just central to getting the virus under control, but allow the economy to keep functioning as well. Because if we're keeping people at home because they can't get access to a test, that has a really big impact. And of course, many of these workers are involved in frontline services too, and it means our hospitals are going to find it more difficult to keep staff in place. And it's scandalous that I've seen constituents unable to access tests, or being told that the next nearest available test is in Scotland. But in terms of Labour's approach, everything that we've done as a new team has been making sure that when we put forward proposals as to how we would do things differently, we make sure that they can stand up to scrutiny, that they're properly costed, that the policy implications have been worked through, because we know it's central to trust in our politics, that people understand that you're taking decisions around how you would spend public money very carefully, that you're making sure it's going to the right place. And Rachel is absolutely right that we do face a really big challenge ahead. We did have that devastating defeat in December. We know we have a real job to listen to voters and rebuild that trust once again. And I think that trust is about voters not just seeing that we share their values around the fairer country that we want to build, but that we're also capable of putting that into action, and that we're competent in delivering that too. And we've got time to do that, and that's what Kia and all of us are absolutely focused on doing, on winning back that trust with the British people once again.
Bridget, do you think Labour could ever, or Rachel, whoever wants to answer, you could ever imagine costing out £100 billion to spend on testing? Well, as Labour would have been laughed at. Do you not think Labour might have been laughed at such a colossal sum of money being presented by a Labour government, perhaps?
Well, I think Bridget makes a really important point that it'd be nice today just to have a functioning test and trace system. Moonshot is fine, but here on planet Earth, people are not being able to get tests right now today. So look, if the government can show us that they can actually deliver the tests, that they will work, then, as we have done throughout this crisis, we have supported what the scientific evidence says is the right approach. But what the scientific evidence has said right since the beginning of this pandemic is that you need an effective test, trace and isolate strategy. And that is what we want the government to focus on now. Because, I just think a lot of this stuff from the government is to deflect from their failure. So every time they fail, they announce a new target. rather than trying to address the problems that we're facing at the moment. And people aren't fools. They don't say, well, you know, it was a shame that I wasn't able to get my test today or tomorrow or the day after, or it's a shame that my results never came through because they lost my test. But I'm very excited that in 6 months' time, we're going to have 10 million tests a day. People are angry with the government now, and they want the government to deliver today because people are dying today.
Okay. Laura, I thought if we could just have a little chat about the other really cheerful subject of Brexit. It might be nice to hear some of your thoughts and what you're hearing really in terms of, you know, we've got COVID, possible economic recovery, but into this we also have Brexit. Perhaps there won't be a free trade agreement. What are your thoughts on the economic outlook, basically, you know, for this autumn and for the fact there might be no deal?
Yeah, not good, generally speaking. So I think at this stage, most likely options, as it currently stands, is that the UK leaves the transition period with either a very, very slim free trade agreement in place, or it leaves without a deal. So the UK and the EU have both identified the 15th of October as sort of the date that any deal must be done by to allow for both parliaments to, particularly the European Parliament, to ratify any agreement. That's just over 3 weeks away. So both sides are currently in the last phase of talks at the moment, but there's been very little substantial progress made. So both sides are still at loggerheads over the issues you hear continually on the news, so fisheries, state aid, governance. That was before the UK government also made things significantly worse in terms of the relationship by threatening to break international law. So if by the 15th of October an agreement hasn't been reached, Boris Johnson has said that the UK would walk away and it would turn its attention to no deal planning. I mean, on that, I would say primarily that there's no amount of planning or government support that can be done that would mitigate entirely against the damage that will be done by no deal and the impact that that would have on the UK economy. It would be colossal. So the UK would crash out overnight from the world's largest trading bloc, a union that we've been a member of for almost 50 years, that we're completely intertwined on so many levels with. Any business who imports, exports, would be negatively affected by the immediate imposition of tariffs and checks overnight. I think if you think that the pandemic was a sharp rupture to the economy, then no deal would be significantly worse. It would hit all sectors very differently, but in a multitude of ways. So there would be changes to things like tariff schedules and non-tariff barriers, and there'd be significant disruption, obviously, as well at ports and borders. So in terms of industries, it would be primarily disproportionately impacting on the manufacturing sectors, who Rachel identified were already suffering because of the pandemic. Automobiles, agriculture. It will also disproportionately impact the Midlands and the north of England, so the very areas that Boris Johnson committed to levelling up at the last election. The impact on Britain's economic recovery from the pandemic it's fairly unquantifiable in some respects, because we just don't know what the state of the economy will be in December when we're set to leave the transition period. But I don't think there's any doubt that it would hinder recovery, and for many businesses it could be potentially fatal. So the Prime Minister had the option, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, to extend the transition period back in June. So it was built into the withdrawal agreement that he could extend for up to 2 years, and he decided, whilst Britain was in a pandemic, whilst we were actually in lockdown, that his government would not take this option to allow for more time, and he instead firmly committed to exiting the EU on the 31st of December this year. So I think the clients that I speak to and businesses generally find this fairly astonishing at a time when many of them sort of are on their knees as a consequence of the pandemic, and they're looking to their government for a life raft. The Prime Minister is instead going to disrupt their supply lines and leave this single biggest trading bloc in the world potentially without a deal. It's worth saying as well, even if we do get a deal, I think it would be best case scenario a very slim free trade agreement at this stage, but it would still require businesses to make significant changes to their supply lines in less than sort of 2 months. So it would be very, very disruptive, be very costly for businesses. Many don't have the bandwidth or the finances at the moment to make these kind of changes. In the event of no deal, those that did sort of prepare stockpiles and stuff ahead of the other several exit deadlines we have had historically, a lot of those stockpiles have now been spent as a consequence of the pandemic. So it is...
And businesses have gone through the reserves that they had.
Yeah.
Okay. For the Brexit planning, sort of went on just COVID resilience in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very, very costly to build up those stockpiles. And the idea that they have time, let alone the resources and bandwidth to do that again, regardless of government support on that, is, I think, completely unrealistic. So it's, yeah, the Conservative Party, the self-appointed party of business and law and order, is simultaneously threatening or actively suggesting that they're going to break international law and doing something that will be incredibly negative for British businesses. I would just end quickly on a more less fatalistic note. There is potentially still the option to extend the transition period. So although the 1st of July deadline has passed, and that's the one that was predicated in the withdrawal agreement, there is some consensus amongst EU lawyers that basically where there's a will, there's a way. If it was that a new transition period or an implementation phase was drawn up and effective as of midnight on the 31st of December to allow even just a bit more time for final negotiations, that is potentially possible, but it would obviously require the UK government to want that and to request something like that. And currently it doesn't look like...
I think the political will is there from the Conservative Party at the moment, but also Labour. I don't think that extending the transition is something that you're even discussing. I'm sure that would just be like, no, it's not something that our party needs to be going back to. No. Okay. I just want to try and get through some final things. And actually, Laura and Kate, I think this is something that you both might have a bit of expertise on, really, is for groups that are trying to pressure the government or lobby on certain things, or, I mean, and if it's something, I mean, you know, now that it's 4 years out from an election, just because it's Conservative majority, do you feel that there's a way of trying to make change? Particularly, Laura, I think you had some views on this. You didn't think that just because there's a Conservative majority that it would be impossible to try and influence policy in quite a significant way.
I don't think it's impossible. I think it makes it very difficult. The reality of an 80-seat majority is, as I said, that the government can do quite a lot with that, with very little pushback. There are sort of very few actual mechanisms in Parliament available to the opposition. Obviously, there's things like select committees and urgent questions where it's an opportunity to hold ministers to account. But unlike last year, you don't have this sort of maverick speaker, and you don't have, you're not facing a very, very slim minority government where it's quite easy to win votes. It would take a substantial Conservative rebellion for the government to lose any votes on this. So I would say, though, that the government have sort of shown a proclivity for U-turning. So where Labour's been really effective is in areas sort of obviously with things like free school meals and the exams. They did public pressure and pressure from the opposition did force the government into U-turning on those issues. So that's certainly possible, but there's by no means a guarantee. I think the best sort of thing for Labour to do at this time would either to be actively working collaboratively with the government, which obviously might come at a political cost, or it would be to continue to sort of scrutinise and hold the government to account. But yeah, they are emboldened by this majority, so it would have to be done on a case-by-case basis.
And Kate, do you think there's some optimism to try and get some of the TUC's agenda actually, on the table and discussed in this Conservative majority government, particularly when it comes to workers' rights and the lowest paid? Do you think they are listening?
Well, it's the TUC's job to stand up for workers, whatever the government. We're not a party political organisation. We have seen progress made. The TUC pushed hard for the job retention scheme. We pushed for it to be extended. We called for sick pay to be available from day one. We've been calling for a long time for some support for those who don't qualify for sick pay or who are low paid. So we have seen, the ability to make change. We often wish that change had come much quicker, particularly those changes around sick pay. That's something we were raising back in March. But, it's our job to keep trying to make the case to government. Government has said it wants to put in place an employment bill. We haven't seen any sign of that yet, but that would be an opportunity for government to make those changes we know we need to see around banning 0 hours contracts, around decent pay for everybody, about better rights for the self-employed. So, we're going to keep making the case. We've seen some signs that government does listen sometimes, and we hope they'll keep doing so because, the livelihoods of millions of working people depend on it.
Thanks very much. Look, I just wanted to ask maybe a bit of a mad question, but it's something that has come up quite a bit. Is do you think there is any chance whatsoever of a government of national unity to deal with the COVID response? Do you think that could ever be foreseen over the next few years? Rachel.
I don't, Kate, think it's something that's on the cards. I remember when Keir was elected as leader, there was some sort of speculation around that time. And what Keir said is that he wanted to work constructively with the government. But I actually think that there's an important role for an opposition during times like this to point out where the government is making mistakes and to encourage them to act. And I think that is an important function. Now, you could say, well, inside you could point out these problems before they occur, but all governments make mistakes, even Labour ones, and an opposition is there to point those out. And I do think that we've been an effective opposition. If you look at the sort of 12 U-turns and counting that have been performed, I don't think that they would have happened without Keir Starmer, Labour backbench MPs, the shadow cabinet pushing for those reforms. Civil society as well. Marcus Rashford, for example, on the free school meals over the summer holidays. But it was a concerted effort as well with all of those U-turns of the Parliamentary Labour Party and the opposition. So I don't actually think it would necessarily be in the national interest to have a national government. I think we're performing an important function. I'd rather have the job of being in government, but I think that we are performing an important function now of pointing out where the government are getting wrong and pushing them to make changes where necessary. So you can never rule something out forever. And obviously, Clement Attlee was Deputy Prime Minister under Winston Churchill at a time of war and made a huge contribution both in our international effort and the effort on the home front. But I think right now we're doing the job that is needed of right now, holding the government to account and pushing them and showing an alternative as well, that there is an alternative way to go about combating both the health crisis and also the economic crisis that we're talking about today.
Okay, thank you. We just had a question from someone that's listening. So, Kate, I wondered if I could ask you this. So they're saying here, should we actually be focusing now on addressing digital inequality? It's really, really important. Many working age adults are struggling online and need these essential digital skills for work. And this is a period in time when it's suggested people work from home, they work from their laptops if they can. And also a lot of the test and trace stuff is done through a computer. Do you think that, there's a case for, in this economic recovery, to look at digital skilling even more and invest in digital to an even greater degree?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And one of the reasons we've said that any job retention, kind of successor to the job retention scheme, should come with training embedded. So our proposal is that anyone working less than 50% of their normal working hours would automatically receive an offer of training. That would be a great opportunity to address some of the skills divide. It's definitely the case that the UK has been underinvesting in skills for a really, really long time. A 40% cut in adult skills funding over the last decade, that lies behind some of the digital inequalities we see, and this is an opportunity to put that right, I think.
Okay. Bridget, do you think it's now time for a huge investment from the government in terms of digital skills, just because actually the workforce is shifting again to an even greater degree of digital, the digital economy?
I mean, I'd agree with everything Kate just said there. And, what Annalisa Dods set out today is that any kind of job retention scheme successor does have to have retraining at its heart, both for those people who, both within the scheme, but also the fact that we did already kind of go into this crisis, have higher than average levels of unemployment in certain regions of the country. So we'll have people who've been out of work for some time who don't have the skills that they need to get back into work, as well as many more people joining them in that queue. So it's going to be a very difficult labour market for lots of people. I mean, the government talks about levelling up. I've yet to see anything properly set out as to what that means in practice. People tend to think it means, bricks and mortar, railway lines, bypasses and so forth. I mean, clearly, investment in our physical infrastructure is essential, and we've seen some parts of the country not receiving their fair share for a very long time. But one of the biggest challenges we face in my part of the world in the northeast is around skills. The fact that we have still low levels of skills amongst too many people within our community. That makes it harder for businesses to grow. It makes it harder for people to get into those well-paid, highly skilled jobs. Skills training, including digital skills, but much more broadly than that. With the kind of hollowing out we've seen of further education over the last decade, will be absolutely central to the recovery that we'll need to see. And digital is a part of that, of course. That's the way the economy's moved, but I think it goes much beyond that too.
And just one last question. This is a question from Brenda, who's been listening. She's asking, should the Labour Party, should the government, should it be focusing on economic sustainability rather than having a focus on growth? And I don't know if Bridget, if you maybe just want to address that one quickly.
Yeah, I don't think they're mutually exclusive would be the short answer. And I think, the kind of growth that we'll need to see in the months and years ahead will be focused on making that transition to net zero and in providing jobs right across the country, particularly in those that need it most, where actually they have most to gain from that kind of transition that we'll need to see towards a greener economy. So I don't think it's an either or choice.
Rachel, do you think similar or?
Yeah, I think, one of the most inspiring bits of our manifesto last year was on the green industrial revolution. And I think we need to build on those policies and those ideas. And actually, in a way, now is the moment to do that, because we do have a shortage of jobs in the economy. We do need to rebalance our economy and create the jobs of the future. And the great thing about green jobs is that they will primarily be in the regions of our country rather than London and the South East. And that is where we need job creation. And as Kate said earlier, it's not just about the quantity of jobs, but also the quality of jobs. And these will be high-skilled jobs in manufacturing, in some of our coastal and rural communities, as well as in our cities. And that's got to be a good thing. So I think the opportunities for our economy to grow in the future are going to be in these technologies. But Brenda is also right to point out that growth at any cost is not growth that we would want to see. We need to see a planet that is greener and cleaner, better environments for all of us to live in, and a world that we want to pass on to our children and our grandchildren as well. But as Bridget says, achieving both things is not mutually exclusive. I think the two go hand in hand.
Okay, so just in the last minute, so I know we're just slightly over, but I just wanted to try and end on a slightly more positive note, if that is at all even achievable. I just wondered if there is anything from this period of time which has given you cause for optimism and hope. Is there anything that you can take away that you think actually, you know, maybe there's something from this where we've learned a positive lesson at all? Kate, Belle, could I just ask you, and maybe just, you know, summarise 20-second answer if that's possible?
I think we've seen kind of just how important people's care for one another is. You know, we've seen people doing absolutely heroic things in their work lives, in their personal lives. We've seen what's really important to people, and we've seen how actually we can move really quickly to change things for people. We have to build on that kind of ability to change things, take that confidence forward, and I think we've seen what really matters to people, and now we need to try and deliver that.
Thank you. Laura, can you think of anything cheerful to say?
I think our work-life balance, for those of us who weren't furloughed or anything, I think that's arguably improved with more remote working, less commute time. Obviously, it would help with childcare and that type of thing, or any kind of caring commitments you've got, the ability to just be able to work from home rather than come into the office 5 days a week. So I think we will see that continue. I can't see sort of in the future people coming back to the offices 5 days a week.
Okay. Bridget, is there anything that gives you cause for hope at all in this economically difficult time?
I think Kate and Laura have probably covered the big ones, so I'll pick something just slightly smaller, but I think important all the same, which is, I think what was really heartening, you know, particularly at the height of the lockdown, was to see so many families, you know, being able to use alternative means of getting around, and actually to see so many kids out on bikes and scooters and playing football in the park, and just the importance of the outdoors and of nature, and the fact that families were thinking more about thinking creatively about how to spend some time when we'd all got fed up of just watching TV all day long with our children when we're meant to be homeschooling.
Yeah. And Rachel, what do you think?
I think I'd go back to where I started, really, and I think that there has been a growing realisation of who the key workers are in our economy. The NHS workers, those in social care, supermarkets, distribution workers, people who work in schools, and without whom the rest of society and the economy wouldn't be able to function. And they are not the highest paid people in our economy, but we are hugely indebted to them. And I think with that debt, that is a debt that needs to be paid. And not only is it about pay, but it's also about recognition and status as well. And so, look, I hope that this pandemic is the jolt that we need to do things differently. I don't want to go back to the way we were before, because the way we were before had huge inequalities in income, in wealth, between men and women, between different parts of the country. The inequalities that if you're a black man, you're 4 times more likely than a white person to die of the coronavirus. I don't want to go back to the way we were before. And I hope that the things that we have learned during this pandemic stay with us afterwards to help us create the fairer and more equal society that I think everybody at Labour Connected wants to see.
Thanks very much. Thanks. That was a really nice point to end on. Thank you very much to the panel, and thank you for listening. It's such an important discussion point, and I hope it's triggered a few ideas and discussions to have amongst you. Thank you very much, everyone. I'll let you get on with the rest of your afternoon and enjoy the rest of Digital Labour Conference. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate.
Thanks.